Hey everybody, Eric Grenier here, and welcome to the Writ Podcast. We're now well into the political year, and there's been no shortage of developments and drama. So, to give us a lay of the land of where things stand in federal politics, the Pollster Panel is finally back. Dan Arnold is Chief Strategy Officer at Pollara and was the Liberals pollster for Justin Trudeau's 3 federal election campaigns. Andrew Enns is Executive Vice President at Léger, and he conducted polling during the Stephen Harper years for the Conservatives. And James Valkey is Director of Research and Strategy at Viewpoints Research and has worked on many central NDP campaigns. Hey guys, welcome back.
Great to be back.
Happy to be here, yeah.
A lot's happened since we last chatted. We last chatted, I think, a week before Election Day. So I wanted to put your predictions. I wanted to hold you guys all to account what you said back in April. But no, instead, we're going to talk a little bit about where things stand at the beginning of this election potential year, the year after the election, 9 months since when Canadians last voted. We had the Pierre Poilievre's leadership review just a little while, just last week. We have the NDP leadership race coming to a close at the end of March. So lots of stuff is going to happen over the next little while. But first, let's start off with a simple question. We're a little more than 9 months after the last election. What has changed in the public opinion environment, if anything, since April 2025? Dan, why don't you kick us off?
Well, look, if we'd gotten together before the holidays, my answer would have been probably not a lot. I did a big research piece with a big sample size in November, December. And, the Liberals were up a bit among seniors. Conservatives were up a bit among younger women. Conservatives were up a bit among blue-collar workers. There were some minor shifts, but at a top line, it was basically the same situation, I think, that we found ourselves in on Election Day. It does seem, from everything that is out there in the public domain, that the Liberals have gotten a bit of a spring in their step in early 2026. I think some of that might be the Davos speech. Pollara is putting out some polling in the next couple of days that shows that actually a majority of Canadians say they watched or saw clips of the Davos speech, which is really rare for something that feels very inside. It's the World Economic Forum. It's a speech on global powers. It's not exactly mainstream, but people seem to notice it, and it seemed to give Carney a bit of a jump. And then I think the other thing that's happening right now is really just a rerun of what we probably talked about the last time we were together, which is when people start worrying about Donald Trump, the Liberals go up in the polls, and Donald Trump has given people plenty to worry about so far in 2026. I think that's given the Liberals a bit of a jump in the polls, at least over the past couple of weeks.
James, how about you go next? What do you think has changed since we last chatted, aside from the actual election result?
The election results a decade ago, just 9 months ago. A lot has changed in the last little while. It feels like it's been a long time. I think I'll stick with the things that I think have stayed the same, and I think that there remains. People are feeling very insecure. There is a sense of resource scarcity that has people really on their back heels. I'm sensing that out in the public. We've seen it in some of the research. And I would say that, to jump off of Dan's point, that Mark Carney has fared well. And mostly because his biggest point of contrast is Donald Trump. He is not being compared to other leaders. He is being compared to the menace south of the border. And in that space, he has so much room to skate. And we've seen a lot of moves in January about how he has skated within that space. Some of them contradictory to one another, but he has a lot of political will, and it's clear he has no problem spending it. So he has been spending a lot of it, really leading with his chin, some would say, but he is out there and he is driving hard to wherever it is he's driving.
Andrew, what do you think?
Well, I'll kind of agree and disagree with James and Dan. I think from December to today, there's been some movement in polling, but I think that whole symptom and that movement is very similar to what we saw last year. We saw, and Dan, you hit it right on the head in terms of the Trump factor and what he does for liberal vote, and particularly that that older generation that seems really predisposed to be, mercurial around when his name pops up or when he invades the country and takes a leader captive. They tend to get recoil and say we got to defend Canada, and Carney is the person. But I will say that. I also don't know whether or not if we had an election, which, there's lots of speculation, I don't know how much has changed. I still feel that, as James has said, some insecurity among voters, affordability, depending on where you are, there's going to be increased anxieties around job security. those things are, if you put those things into a campaign, they're going to get equal. They're going to get some equal attention. Trump's going to get his attention, and we very much end up in sort of this same situation as sort of two message tracks really slugging it out. And it, like, our Léger poll that we put out last week, I think would be really good news if it held for the Liberal Party. Unquestionably. I memean, healthy lead, healthy in Ontario and healthy in British Columbia, and very healthy in Quebec. But does it hold? That I don't. I think that environment of the sort of the shifting public opinions, I think, is still very similar to what we saw in the in a campaign 9 months ago, where people will move, and the younger generation will probably glom on to more affordability and economic messages. And I think, Mr. Poilievre has work to do, but he still may have a receptive audience there.
We'll keep it first on the Liberals before we talk about the other parties. The fact that the Liberals have seemingly held on to their vote. The couple of polls we've seen have had them still around the 43 or even higher that they had in the last election. And Mark Carney's approval ratings have gone up since Davos, but they were still holding pretty well going into that speech. Dan, is it unusual that the Liberals have been able to hold this coalition together, considering that it seemed to be very circumstantial?
Well, it depends. It's I guess unusual if you treat this as the 10th year of a Liberal government. It's not unusual if you treat this as the first year of a Mark Carney government. New governments come in, they can usually keep a honeymoon going for a year or more in some cases. I think, from my experience in the Trudeau government, it really wasn't until you got to kind of like 2017, I think, that things started to kind of go down for him. Wab Canoe's still riding his honeymoon wave in Manitoba. So, in that respect, I think, Carney maybe is maybe in some respects just surfing a bit on what started in the election. And to his credit, I think he's done a very good job at neutralizing problems before they become problems. He did this with the carbon tax, obviously heading into the last campaign, but since then, he's made moves on crime, he's made moves on immigration. You could even look at the floor crossing this week, where they got the provincial NDP deputy leader to run as their candidate, as almost shoring up his potential vulnerability on the left as well too, and Danielle Martin, who's a healthcare advocate. So maybe even bringing in some progressives now to cut off a potential, he's another conservative type of attack that might come his way from the NDP. So, as long as Carney keeps shooting down these potential threats before they metastasize into something more dangerous, I think those numbers should hold for a little while at least.
Andrew, Mark Carney, how do you get the sense from public opinion how he is viewed? Because there has been lots of talk about how he's actually just a progressive conservative, and it's the first PC government since Mulroney, those kinds of comments. But Dan just pointed out they just recruited a new Democrat. Do you get the sense that Canadians view Mark Carney as being from the left or from the center or from the right?
I think they view Mark Carney as being very secure and very stable. I think that his, he benefited from really coming onto the scene with really an unblemished kind of introduction. Businessman, Bank of Canada, governor of several banks, Bank of England, Bank of Canada, man who can deal with crisis, the economic crisis. I think all those things still hold true, and they provide that security. And I think as Dan sort of mentioned, I think there is probably more of a sort of small c conservative, calm, stable approach to how he's managing things. I see that, and I say that largely how he deals with Donald Trump and stuff. I really find now Trump will fire off something, at 2 a.m. on Truth Social. People will be jumping on the PMO for comment. Carney will come out a couple of days later. Yep, we saw it. We're good. We're not going to overreact, and I think that sort of stability really connects well with folks. I think you've got, in our polling, you see 1 in 4 conservative voters today will give Mark Carney a thumbs up. Like, you didn't see that with Justin Trudeau, and so I think that that's important for that overall approval rating that's running far and away ahead of his, of the polling numbers. And it does afford him a good platform to get some things, moving. In my view, it presents a bit of a caution for Poilievre with respect to how he handles things on that front. So no, I think like I'm kind of waiting for the left to kind of put up. I mean, we saw it with the Alberta MOU on the pipeline. The First Nations, I think, was the first time there was real deliberate pushback. But certainly the environmental groups, I haven't seen much yet. And I think people are sort of like, he still gets so much latitude because he's the guy to defend us against the real unpredictable threat that we're facing that we just haven't really got our heads around yet.
James, what do you think about that in terms of that coalition that Carney has, and whether he has that vulnerability on the left?
Dan mentioned the Deputy Leader of the Ontario NDP deciding to be appointed as the candidate in Scarborough. On the same day, Carney's coalition is so big that Conservative MP Jamil Javani announced he was going to go to Washington to help renegotiate NAFTA on behalf of the government, with which, the government has since tried to distance itself and said, oh, Dominic LeBlanc briefed him, but he's not on our behalf. I mean, that is a broad coalition under one day. And like I said, he's leading, spending that political capital that he's got. But if I look to the future, and this is again to Dan's point that they've done a good job of identifying those threats and trying to put a lid on them. There is precarity in the economy. Housing starts are way friggin' down. There is debate as to whether or not we are in a recession right now. If the U.S. dollar collapses, if the U.S. economy collapses, we are going to feel it, right? If the elephant sneezes, we feel it. There are some real threats that are approaching us on the horizon. And again, there is that sentiment of insecurity, that precarity, and that breeds volatility. And we've seen that. And while the wind is at his back and the sun is in his face right now for Mark Carney, as we've seen in the last 18 months, things change fast.
Dan, we've seen that Mark Carney's approval ratings have jumped up over the last few weeks. At most polls, he's now well over 50%. So he's polling way ahead of the Liberal Party. We've seen that from the Nanos poll with the Prime Minister tracking, where he's well ahead of the Liberals. What does that mean? Does it mean that inevitably the Liberals will be dragged up? Or is it kind of, like the people who approve of Mark Carney that are currently voting for the NDP, does that mean anything? Are they gettable, or is it just they're stuck with their party, and whether or not they like the Liberal leader is kind of irrelevant?
I think you can at least look at those people who are not voting Liberal but are positive towards Carney as gettable, as you put it, if you're kind of looking at a universe. And this is what the parties are doing, I'm sure, internally. They're looking at not just the voters they have now, but where's that growth potential? And there's different ways you can ask that question, but I think at the very least, you would say this signals some growth potential if he can convert those people. And maybe those voters don't move until you actually get into a election campaign. And we've seen this many times throughout history where NDP voters, or even to some extent Bloc voters last election, when they kind of get squeezed and have to choose between Carney or Poilievre, or whatever the top of the ticket decision is, that's when they move. And I think if you have a lot of NDP and Bloc voters who are at least comfortable with Carney, feel government's heading in the right track, however you ask the question, I think the Liberals would look at that as people they could maybe squeeze into their tent if Poilievre is still there as the big bad in the next election campaign, that they can put up as the contrast to him.
Andrew, James, any thoughts on like the leader numbers versus the voting intentions, anything like that?
I mean, it's way easier to get votes if they don't hate you, and it's even easier if they really do like you or respect you. And I think that's it's certainly a benefit for Mr. Carney in the sense of that it allows them to go out in a lot more places and a lot more stakeholders where you're going to get a reasonably positive response. I think it's also a bit of the challenge for Mr. Poilievre, and I remember back in the day doing work for Stephen Harper in the early minority days, and the goal there was just to take the temperature down. I mean, we accepted the fact that you're never going to flip the I really don't like this guy to I really, really like this guy. But what you want to do is just, they don't have to love you, but it's really kind of helpful not that they don't hate you in terms of treating
Yeah.
your vote.
I would back Andrew's sentiment up there. Like the horse race numbers have the parties, the Liberals and Conservatives pretty well positioned where they are. However, if you start looking at the leadership numbers, that is where the biggest vector of difference comes into play, right? Like, I think that they know this on the Conservative side, and we've seen some signals of them trying to soften Pierre's image. But I can tell you from qualitative work that that's a big hill to climb. And like Andrew said, it's not necessarily about winning everybody over you can win over. It is trying to move the numbers of those people that should be in your camp that aren't. And I mean, when you look at the demographic breakdown by age, it's if you look at polling over the last 20 years, it's almost inconceivable that the Liberals are that far ahead with 65 plus, and the Conservatives are leading the chase under 40 people under 45 or under 35. That is, I wouldn't say not normal, but I would say it is an aberration of what we have seen in polling patterns. And I think if you're a conservative strategist, you're probably looking at that saying, how do we just get back to what we were? Because that will set us up for a better place to be at in the future.
All right, well, let's move on to the Conservatives then. Pierre Poilievre's just survived his leadership review, so that at least is in the rearview mirror. But he still has that big deficit on the leadership numbers, and just at least over the last week or two has fallen further back in the polls. Andrew, when you look at the Conservative strategy, what they've been playing out, it does seem to be about a bit more about holding what they have rather than really explicitly trying to grow it. But what are the prospects for Pierre Poilievre as he's looking towards his second election campaign as leader?
Well, as you say, I think I don't think the result was really ever, seriously in question, but just getting it done is important, as you said. It's good to put it in the review mirror. I believe, I know it was a preoccupation. They were obviously making sure that they would get the result that would allow them to move forward. They've got it. I think now, like there are some question marks. I mean, as I said earlier, if I was the Liberal camp, I look at sort of Léger's last polling numbers and go, phew, let's go. Like these are pretty good. You got the NDP at single digits. Got a good lead got a good running start on the Tories. Let's go now. I think for the Conservatives, you probably want a bit of runway, and I think part of what they need to think strategically is, and it's not. I would suggest probably not a hallmark of Mr. Poilievre, but a little bit of patience. A little bit of being fairly deliberate on some message tracks, and see about, not necessarily being always every chance you get pushing the button for an election, but looking at it and as you say, seeing some signs of that. We'll see if they can kind of continue in terms of collaborating where it makes sense and some of that stuff, because I do think that as James has talked about, things look pretty good for the Liberals and Mr. Carney and the government, but there is a lot of if we were walking the pasture in the Interlake Manitoba, there's a lot of cow pies in there that you could step in at any time, and so I think, patience, do your job as opposition, but Mr. Poilievre has sort of sent a signal that he's going to be a little more accessible to the media, did some of those year-end interviews. I don't think that's a bad thing. I think, he needs to continue to sort of, he can still be an aggressive opposition. It's a tough spot, but I do think that, taking that tact is probably, where to go, and be prepared for potentially a little bit longer run in opposition, as much as it probably pains them.
Dan, what do you think about the challenges that Poilievre faces?
Yeah, I mean, look, the leadership review vote was a good number for him. And I think we've established that the Conservative base likes him. We've established that he can win battle over Crowfoot. The question is, can he grow beyond that? And I don't think we have evidence from polling that is the case as of yet. So, maybe it is a matter, like, I kind of agree with what Andrew said in terms of like waiting for your moment. as the great philosopher Eminem once said, you only get one shot. Do not miss your chance to blow. This opportunity comes once in a lifetime. And I don't think Poilievre will get a second shot, but he's not going to get a third shot, is I guess what I'm saying here, because I think if he loses the next election, that's it for him. So he should probably wait for the right moment, and the right moment is probably not when people are freaked out about Trump for the reasons we just talked about in terms of what's buoying the Liberal support. It's probably when another issue comes along, or if he can actually land a critique against Carney. At this point, he hasn't really landed anything against Carney. They've tried a lot of different attacks. I think it's fair to say nothing has really stuck. So, maybe it is just buying time and hiding behind curtains and, waiting for the right moment to when the ground's going to be a bit riper for him.
Yeah, but they don't hold all the cards, right? The Liberals have one big trump card that they can play at any point that they want. James, what do you think about where the Conservatives stand at the beginning of this year?
Well, I think my kids would say quoting Eminem is peak millennial cringe. So I will eschew that to not give away my age. But I think, look, it's obvious. Poilievre has a deafening unlikability that they need to fix. Pardon my language. That's what it comes down to. I'm sorry, we're dancing around it. But there are people that are repelled by the personality he has presented to date. And they have a job of softening that and fixing it. Because when the leadership qualities are, you're trailing by a country mile on where the horse race numbers aren't that far apart, it is you, and he needs to fix it. And I think we've seen that. I think the tacit offering to support the government is kind of a way of saying we are not in a rush to have a federal election anytime soon with these conditions. I think they need to fix that, and that's my presumption. And he's still got a bit of he's got to find a path that's not quite so Trumpy. And as Dan said, he needs to find a critique against the government that sticks the landing. And I don't think it's found it yet.
Yeah, I would say, I mean, I didn't catch the full speech at the convention. I caught some of the coverage and then looked online. But I mean, I think an opportunity was missed to do two things. One, and they go hand in hand. One, reflect on the fact that, look, there was a big moment in 9 months ago in that election campaign, and Canadians we were faced with a threat from the U.S. Canadians looked at the options, and I didn't measure up. I mean, I think that's and to reflect on that. I mean, it's not I guess I'm a pollster and not a political strategist, so I would say you be a little humble and say, look, for reasons I didn't pick up on, I came up short on that question. And I would argue that's still a big problem, because when, as Dan said right at the beginning, when Trump comes into the news and becomes a threat, Liberals go up, Conservatives don't move. And the second thing I would say, and related to that first, is that I do think that Mr. Poilievre has to find a way to work into his narrative in terms of Canada and his approach to talk about Trump, trade, in this whole thing. Like, he studiously avoids mentioning the guy's name, and I think I think he has to articulate Canada's position vis-a-vis Trump and his defense of Canada in light of what the president asserts at different times. And I think, I believe that's still something that has to be sort of addressed, probably even maybe personally with him, but I think it has to happen, because the conversation, I think, as we move into the year, Kuzma is going to become very much part of that conversation. Trade, there's going to be some real hard decisions by the government, and I think Mr. Poilievre needs to be part of that conversation if he's going to sort of somehow at the end of this come out of this in an electorally favorable spot. Because these will be really hard decisions if you're the government, that you ultimately have to make them. But I think Poilievre can't have that conversation in a way that doesn't mention Donald Trump by name, and he just has to figure out how to do that in a way that doesn't blow up.
Can I toss an idea out here? Yeah, James was talking about the need for Poilievre to have a bit of a makeover, a new image. And we needed someone who's serious for the moment. Like, what if he were to wear glasses to show seriousness as a bit of a political makeover? Do you think that would make a difference, maybe, as a new Poilievre?
Yeah, maybe a beard. You can try to get some, gray in it and that kind of stuff. but like, let's say, you look at if you separate where maybe the Liberals are, the Conservatives have been in the polls, depending on the poll, depending on the week, they can always get between 35 and 40%. And during Aaron O'Toole, Andrew Scheer, and even for a lot of the back half of the Harper years, they would have loved to have those numbers.
100%.
So why is that not okay? Like, why is that not good enough? Why not just be kind of satisfied with just maintaining that number and assuming that it'll be enough to win next time?
Well, I think you need to ask James that question because he needs to get his party up over 10%. But quite bluntly, all of this is window dressing. If the NDP poll at less than 15% in the country, I think it's a really hard path for the Conservatives to win, unless they make a massive breakthrough in some areas where they haven't done so in decades. Like, it's really the map just gets really hard. Two party races just don't favor the Conservatives in Canada.
Is there anything the Conservatives can do? James, maybe you can, because
I'm writing a note to all the NDP leadership candidates to give them advice to how to help Poilievre. So please jump on.
Yeah, but how? Like, is there something that the Conservatives can do? Because, like, obviously, if they can maintain the 30, if they can maintain 37, 38, and the Liberals fall back to a more historically normal number, then that'll be good enough to win. But is there something that they can do to try to get that to happen? If their ceiling is 40, and so they need the Liberals to drop down, and it has to go to somewhere else, can the Conservatives have any agency in this? Like, or are they just passive and hoping that Avi Lewis or Heather McPherson does the work for them?
My presumption is they're not passive. My assumption is that they're asking themselves these questions, and they are testing the best way to position Pierre against Donald Trump. The fact that hasn't said anything about that tells me that they don't have a conclusive path yet. At least their research hasn't presented it with them, because I always assume people make good decisions based on well-funded, good research planning. But they haven't got there yet. There is a field of thought that they came, like, in Poilievre's speech, they're still talking about how well they did in the last election campaign. They've toned that down a little bit, but they're still taking credit for some of the things. And to be truthful, they did well. They had some expansion in the 905. They took more seats from the New Democrats than the Liberals did. Like, they expanded where they are, and there is a theory that we don't have to change much. We just have to have different conditions. And I don't think that's a good theory or a good plan, but I'm not sure what their plan is. They need to find a way to position themselves in contrast to Mark Carney. And, as we said, he has got a lot of political capital right now, and I think they're going to find a hard way of positioning themselves against him that way.
Okay, well then let's move on to the NDP leadership race, because a lot of what happens in the future will depend on whether the NDP makes this less of a two-party race, right? James, why don't you kick us off on this? So, Avi Lewis seems to be raising the most money, could make him the favorite to win it. If it's not him, it looks like Heather McPherson would have the next best shot. But first off, do you think this race is having any impact, is having any broader effect on the New Democrats and how they're viewed outside of the people who are excited about this race?
I don't know. And I say that in all honesty. We've seen a lot of volatility. I mean, if you just look at the public polling that's available, New Democrats are anywhere between 14% in the recent ECOS or Nanos poll to as low as 5% or 6%, and that's a big swath. That's well outside a margin of error for any of them. So it tells me there's a lot of volatility out there in the field. So I think the federal party is having a strong internal conversation about what their next step is. They have many contrasting views. There has been some excitement with some of the leaders in the race. I think those fundraising numbers are not to be dismissed. I think the conversation is internal right now. Like, they don't have official party status in the House of Commons, except for Heather McPherson. None of the other leadership contenders don't have a seat in the House of Commons. So it's an uphill battle. They're going to struggle through it as they see fit, but I don't know if it's impacting the overall narrative across the country. Certainly, there are some people who would like to see the New Democrats disappear in Ontario and on the federal scene, but I don't think that's happening either. I think that there's a lot of staying power in some of these places, and we're seeing a bit of a bump, if I'm being honest, in some of the regional numbers on a federal landscape that offer glimmers of hope of what's to come next. If we mark, that less than 7% showing in the last federal election as the low water mark, hey, there's only up to go from there, Eric.
But yeah.
Ever the optimist, eh?
Just because you have your ears a bit closer to the ground on this one than the rest
section in the
of us.
Conservative Party of Canada to get better than 6%.
Yeah, maybe there'll be a lot of donors from Pierre Poilievre's team to the NDP. But James, just quickly, since you're closer to this than any of us, do you have a sense of the race? Do you have a notion of how it's shaking out?
I don't. You hear certain things. Those numbers that were reported in the fundraising were Q4. So Avi had $770,000 raised, which is, to be I think we all need to admit that is no small feat for a party that doesn't have official party status in the House of Commons. And apparently he is claiming he's raised over $1 million. There have been rumors of membership number sales, but nothing has been official yet. There's a big English language debate that's coming up, English leaders language debate that's coming up. I think everybody is anticipating that greatly. We saw one of the candidates, Rob Ashton, make a hard pivot against Avi in a video in January. The race is getting hotter, and now that the membership numbers are in, we're going to see a bit more positioning. Some of the candidates may start to be explicit about, I'm your first ballot candidate, but I encourage you to vote for candidate B for your second ballot candidate. There might be more of that in the coming days, but we'll see. It's very unclear to me how it's all going to unfold. I'm sure if anybody is subscribed, your inboxes are filled with emails and messages that you can't get through, and I'm firmly in that camp right now, Eric. But it's difficult to tell the pulse at the moment. I think it'll be clear now that the membership deadline is closed. That information is going to be more public, and it's going to be more obvious who the front runner is and how everything's going to line up.
Dan, what options does the NDP have? What lanes are open to them? Whoever the leader ends up being.
Yeah, it's really interesting because, the three perceived frontrunners are all running in very different lanes, as you put it. Avi is the activist. Heather is kind of Western NDP, right? She's from Alberta, a little more establishment. And then Rob Ashton is, he's the dock worker, right? So they're all targeting very different demographics. And on the Pollara Substack, I wrote up a piece recently where we showed people different videos from the different leadership candidates who are open to voting NDP. And you can see blue collar workers very excited when they see Rob Ashton's video, white collar, more educated workers drifting a bit more towards McPherson and Lewis. So, the direction that the party goes, I think really depends a lot on the leader. And it's a very different NDP if it's an NDP that is fighting for blue collar workers in Northern Ontario and Northern Vancouver Island versus one that is more kind of activist downtown. The ridings that are in play are very different under those two scenarios. So yeah, I'll be very curious to see how it turns out. I think Avi's going to win. As you've written about, Eric, it's very rare for someone to have this type of fundraising lead that doesn't materialize into a win when all is said and done. But at least at a conceptual level, it's an interesting choice on the table.
Andrew, we were talking about how the Conservatives would want to see the NDP do better. They also don't want to lose seats to the NDP, right? So they have to have that balancing act. Sure. So who would the Conservatives like to see out of the three front runners?
Well, I think Dan articulated it pretty well. I think Ashton probably would start to intrude in some of those seats that they did win and down in Windsor and North Vancouver Island and in those areas in Northern Ontario. So I think certainly Avi Lewis would likely be the kind of candidate that I suspect they could they would probably not feel as threatened by. I think the NDP, first of all, actually I think it's important that the NDP get this settled, and ideally they have a leader that has some presence and has some media presence, because I do feel that as much as we've talked about Prime Minister Carney and how he's doing well and he's got a fair amount of runway, there are some challenges. There are things on the domestic front that are going undone. And I think, quite frankly, and I say this with, knowing that my inbox may fill up with mail, sometimes when Pierre Poilievre is pointing those out, it falls on deaf ears because people see Pierre Poilievre and go, I'm not listening to that guy. So another voice challenging the government and pushing the government, not necessarily on the trade front, but on the home front, on some of those matters, would not be unhelpful, I think, even from the Conservative perspective, as presenting kind of that, hey, we got to do more. There is some shortcomings of this government. So we'll see what Mr. Lewis has to say. I think the NDP, when it comes to trade and those will suffer somewhat the same problem as what the Conservatives and Poilievre face, in the sense that it's tough to articulate your position and not be seen as being in the way and obstructing and not being a team player. Like, we should, whatever Carney says we need to do in terms of dealing with Trump, we all better be there. And Poilievre hasn't always been there, and I think he suffers by it. Oh, you're obstructing. You're not being helpful. So it's hard on that, and I think the NDP will probably run into that too. But we'll see. No party status. Like, whoever wins. I remember some of my early days working with Jean Charest. It's a lot of crappy cold chicken dinners on the menu for a while.
I will say, the party was to echo off what Andrew had said. The party did. I believe, was punished for supporting the Liberal government for maybe as long as they did. The Liberals replaced their leader, and seemingly the narrative changed. New Democrats didn't. And I think they dragged that reputation a little bit with themselves into the election. I think with a new leader, you have an opportunity to refresh the entire brand. No doubt the red team and the blue team are going to throw their critiques at the new leader, whoever that may be. But it is an opportunity for them to start anew. And I think for New Democrats, a lot of longstanding New Democrats, they're looking forward to that opportunity to turn the page and start fresh under a new leader under these current conditions.
Dan, do you think the Liberals can count on the NDP not getting themselves back into it, that it does become a three-way race again?
I mean, that's their hope, I guess. Look, I don't think you want to ever underestimate your opponents. The NDP was kind of down at this level, maybe a little bit higher than this, but in the 90s. I mean, they were kind of non-existent, and then Léger came, and it sort of did give them, over time, gradual momentum that finally spilled over, obviously, in 2011. So I don't think you can count out a party that has the same type of roots the NDP does. But I think, look, as long as NDP voters are worried about the Pierre Poilievre, Donald Trump combo, like the same dynamics that were in play last election are still there. I don't think people hated Jagmeet Singh last election campaign. Like, his personal approval ratings weren't great, but they weren't toxic. So I think the thing that undid the NDP more than anything last election was this fear of Poilievre, and specifically on the Trump question. And, if that's still the dynamic, I think it's hard for the NDP to win a lot of those voters back. I think a new leader can definitely excite the voters they have and maybe boost their turnout a bit and maybe bring in some new people. But I think that the underlying dynamics kind of have to shift if you're going to see the NDP back in the 15-20% range.
I'll add, Eric, one of the things that I'm seeing, we were hearing a little bit of, and I'm watching it very closely, is that, I've said Mark Carney has a lot of political capital and he's spending it. Well, just this week we saw this four-party 3D chess move where Bill Blair gets appointed to the ambassadorship, and then a Liberal or an NDP deputy leader gets nominated, not even having a nomination meeting, gets nominated to run in his spot, and then a federal member of parliament from Beaches says, I'm actually going to run in her seat provincially, and I'm also running to be leader of the provincial party, all within a matter of hours. There comes a point where the calculus of it all becomes very obvious, and I would suggest that maybe the Liberals are, if they're making decisions at this level, they need to be thinking about this level, and there may be an opportunity for New Democrats to start talking about that grassroots political nature, what democracy means, and how we engage in politics. And I do think that for for the new candidates, they will need to contrast themselves very strongly against Mark Carney and the way he does business. Because while the public may favor how he is executing things currently, that can turn, and the mood can turn really quick as well too. And for New Democrats, they need to position themselves in contrast to the party in power.
Okay. We'll finish off on this, the big question, whether there'll be an election this year. I assume none of you at this stage, aside from the Bloc Québécois, would suggest to the Conservatives and Democrats to try to force an election. I don't think nobody would make that case. All right. No one wants to make it. Okay, so if you're advising, you're looking at all the data that we've seen out there, and you're advising now the Liberals. Would you advise them to go to an election campaign this year? Andrew, why don't you start off with that?
Yeah, I would actually, I'd probably, if you're in the Liberal camp and you see what's coming, I'd probably say yes, you should go, but I would also be pretty clear in terms of there's more risks involved than probably meet the eye, and certainly more risks involved than meet the eye when you look at polls the last couple of weeks, post Davos. I mean, it looks really good, but I do think that there are real risks out there. First of all, I would say they should go, because I think the longer, as James has said, the capital is spent, at some point you run out, and you really, are you going to be able to get demonstrable progress on some of these major projects, on some of these some of those big promises on housing? The record to date in the first 9 months is it's harder it's easier to say, harder to do. So that would be my concern, and say, get your majority while you can, while the numbers look good, and then you're not as under the pressure to deliver something in the next 18 months or something like that. But the risks to me are, right now you're counting on really strong results in Quebec, and there's a dynamic in Quebec politics right now in terms of provincially that could throw a wrench into that really quickly. And we even saw that in his post-Davos, but his pre-caucus, pre-cabinet retreat speech, where he got himself in a little hot water. So very dynamic situation. British Columbia is another place where you've got provincially another dynamic situation that could create sort of a problem for you if you think you can sweep, do very well in that province. So there's risks there that could actually, in my view, you could result right back where we are. Strong minority, but still that minority situation. But as Dan has said, you might at that point have kneecapped the Conservative leader if you can't get it over the finish line, and you buy yourself some time there. So but I think I'd counsel going, simply because it's probably as good as it's going to get, but there are risks.
James, how about you? You're advising.
I want
the
to hear
Liberals.
from Dan first. Come on, man.
No, I'm curious.
I'm just kidding. No,
Dan has made this kind of pitch before, so I'm curious. James, what would you do?
If I were cynical, if I were a Liberal, if I was advising the Prime Minister with a minority government.
If you were cynical, you would be a Liberal.
If I was cynical. No, I didn't say that. I didn't say that. The conditions are such that it feels as though he has got a lot of political capital. And when you have political capital, you spend it judiciously. Does he want to spend a bunch of it on an unnecessary, expensive election campaign that nobody wanted and nobody asked for? Or does he spend it on an election campaign that gives him that strong, stable majority government to drive Canada in the direction it needs, in contrast to the U.S.? Look, I just argued myself yes to both of those scenarios, Eric. I don't know what the path forward is. The threats on the horizon are very, very real. And they must know that. As a central banker, certainly he must know that and see the stuff that's happening underlying beneath the U.S. economy. And that's going to be, despite all this trade BS, we still trade the majority with the U.S. economy. That is the fuel as part of a lot of our economy. And it's going to impact us regardless of trade deals or adjustments that we have with China. So I don't know. I would say that conditions are perfect until they turn out badly, in which case I didn't say that. Someone else said it.
So we got a cautious yes from Andrew, a advice that probably gets him fired, I think, from James.
I should write fortune cookies because I said nothing, but I said so much.
I can imagine. From everything we've heard, I don't think Mark Carney would like whatever you think is correct, boss.
Well, hey.
Go with what your heart tells you, Mark.
Yeah.
It's probably in their best interest to call one early, but I think there are some massive risks.
All right, Dan, you were around during the decision in 21 to go early. So you're looking at the data. What's the advice, or at least the counsel you're giving this time?
Yeah, I was in that position in 2021. And I think in that case, look, in hindsight, I think it was the right decision, because I don't think fighting an election in 2023, given the state that Trudeau's popularity was and the state the world was in 2023, would have been better. So I don't regret that decision, but I think it's fair to say that the first week of that campaign, the polls kind of tanked, and there was a real backlash to Trudeau calling the early election, and that may be because he didn't have a compelling reason to call the election. It's a bit about vaccine mandates and COVID, but then it kind of became about a plan, and he didn't really have a plan. And I think things kind of unraveled, if we're being honest about it, early on in that campaign, because it wasn't a clear message. I really liked what James was saying there about the need for a strong, stable majority government to take on Trump. Like, I think that's, I think we can give James credit if that's what Carney does run on and give his excuse for the next election campaign. Because I do think
that was Stephen Harper, 2011. That's how he closed the deal in 2011. Those were his words.
And there's a lot of Carney-Harper similarities in many ways, I think, over the years. So, like, if Carney could go at it with a message like that, I think it might be worth a risk. I think if I was him, I'd rather get 3 or 4 floor crossers and just kind of like get my majority that way. But if that's not on the table, then I think, you kind of have to pick your moment, or your moment gets picked for you by the opposition, and you're always better off picking the moment yourself. And this feels like a decent moment.
Dan, our Léger polling says that's unethical if Carney gets his majority through floor crossers, just so you know.
Well, I'm sure he'll get a lot of angry letters in the PMO correspondence about that, but I don't think that's going to necessarily shed too many tears if he's got another 3 years in government.
Yeah, with all due respect, Andrew, to the Léger polling, I'm going to blame your respondents. They said that they would be less likely to vote for a floor crosser, much less likely. Yep. History does not suggest that people actually...
I would imagine you looked into that.
Yeah, they don't really reject it all that much when it comes to actually voting. So I guess we'll see. Do you guys just... yes/no election in 2026, that it actually will happen?
I think yes.
I think yes.
I'll say no, just to be contrarian.
I would rather not. I'm not up for one this year. Next year would be better. All right. Well, I guess we'll see. It'll be
you will have at least a lot of by-elections this year, if not an election to talk about.
It'll be like rolling by-elections. I think we can just be in a constant by-election season for about 6 months, which is great. Too bad none of them are all that competitive, but I guess we'll see. All right. Well, we'll get another chance to chat. I won't wait as long next time for gathering you guys back, so really appreciate it. And it's going to be hopefully a great year for politics. It usually has some surprises for us. So thanks a lot, guys, for joining me today.
Perfect.
Thank you for having us, Eric.
Thanks.